According to Dr. Millard Erickson, there are two different ways in which people try to understand who Jesus was and what he did. Now, the first way is they try to understand what he did based on who he was. The second way is that they try to understand who he was based on what he did. Now, these are, of course, two very different approaches that start in different spots, right? The first approach started with who Jesus was. The second approach started with what Jesus did. Now, if we look at this, we'd say, isn't it better to start with who Jesus was? Because if we don't know who Jesus was, then a lot of the things that he did isn't going to make sense to us, right? Jesus dying on the cross doesn't make a lot of sense to us on why he died on the cross if we don't know that Jesus was the Son of God come down to save us, things like that. So a lot of people, they're really drawn to this idea of start with Jesus, who he was, then interpret the Bible and interpret what he did based on who he was. And of course, like I said, there's benefits to that, but the problem is, what are you basing who he was off of if you haven't even read Scripture yet, right? If you don't start with what he did, then how do you know who he was? Things like that. So a lot of people, they fall into this trap of not checking out what he did. Instead, they go straight for who he was or who they believe he was. And if you're not going to base it off of what he did, then you have to base it off of whatever you want, I guess, right? If maybe you know a little bit of Scripture and you're like, well, it seems as though Jesus was a really nice teacher, so maybe that was all he was. Maybe he was just a really nice teacher. He didn't die on the cross for my sins or anything like that. He was just a really nice teacher. Well, imagine trying to read the Bible through that perspective. If you've already assumed that Jesus was not God, he was just a really nice teacher, then you're going to read the actions that Jesus did based on that interpretation that you have of Jesus. So we need to be careful about that, because it leads to biasness, because we're assuming things about Jesus before we actually understand who Jesus was based on what he did. So that would be my advice to you guys. Read the Bible, get a little bit of a glimpse, an understanding of who Jesus was. And then once you understand who Jesus was, you'll be better able to understand a little bit more about what he did, things like that. So you kind of have to start with what he did to understand who he was. And then once you understand a little bit more about who he was, you can then understand more about what he did. And this is not a short process, right? I've read through the Bible many times. I've gotten multiple degrees in theology and biblical studies and stuff like that. And I am still learning. People have been studying the Bible for centuries. This is not going to be a short process. This is going to be a lifelong process of you trying to understand who Jesus was based on what he did, and understanding what he did based on who he was, things like that. So I would encourage you guys to try and study that for yourselves. Don't try and just trust what your pastor says. Don't try and trust what your Sunday school teacher. Don't trust what the media says. Don't completely just put your trust in them. Study it for yourself to try and figure out what Jesus did so you can better understand who he was, things like that. So hopefully that makes sense.